It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Starring the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein and the robust Robert Begley. I am Andrew Bernstein, and you are indubitably Robert Begley. How you doing today, Robert?
I am doing fabulous, Andy. Happy to be here with Hero Show John Hersey back in business, and we are in Ouray, Colorado, which is the location of Galt's Gulch.
Yes, from Galt's Gulch. Welcome back to the Hero Show. Returning to his roots, the indefatigable John Hersey. Welcome back. Welcome back to the Hero Show, John.
Thanks, Andy, and happy belated birthday.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I was celebrating it the last couple of days, a little bit hungover from too much cheesecake at Junior's in Brooklyn. But we have a special show today, don't we? Celebrating the Fab Four.
That's right. The Fab Three will celebrate the Fab Four today.
Well, maybe the terrific trio will celebrate. We'll celebrate the Fab Four. And I'm old enough to remember Beatlemania, in 1963 and 1964 when the Beatles burst on the scene. But anyway, we used to give the background. The Beatles were formed, 1960, 1962?
Yeah, 1960 officially was when Ringo joined, and they became first the Silver Beatles and the Beatles.
Having evolved from the Quarrymen, a band John Lennon had in high school. So 1960, sadly broke up in 1970, broke a lot of people's hearts. But what a decade of extraordinary, innovative and creative music they left us, didn't they?
Yeah, changed the world. I think it's safe to say the Beatles certainly changed the music industry, but I think they even changed the world. You can't think of the 1960s without thinking of Beatles. If we look at the timeline, right after John Kennedy got assassinated, November 63, America was in mourning. Beatles come 2 months later on the Ed Sullivan Show, and the United States was just completely, as you were there, you remember that.
I do remember. I remember John Kennedy's assassination, and I remember the Beatlemania. Yeah, what you're saying is absolutely true. Now, John Lennon was born in 1940. Is that correct?
That's right.
Assassinated in 1980 by a lunatic fan who loved him. Was that Mark Chapman? Was that
Mark
the
Chapman? Yeah, a couple of blocks from where I lived. Dakota 72nd Street and Central Park West. I lived on 70th and Columbus, and it was a mob scene.
So Paul McCartney was a year younger, I think, and and Sir Paul is still rocking on. You and Rosalie saw Sir Paul recently, didn't you, John?
My wife and I did just a few weeks ago. It was about a week before his 80th birthday, and man, he's still going strong. His vocal cords are, 2 years from now will mark the 60th anniversary of their premiere on the Ed Sullivan Show, which is just amazing. A 60 plus year career. I mean, because of course Ed Sullivan was 4 years into the Beatles already, and Paul McCartney was going strong before that. So,
right. And George and Ringo are both a year or two younger than
George.
John.
When they were honing their chops, they went to Hamburg, and George Harrison was only 17, and there was this dispute about whether he could play in a bar. And it was interesting because playing in Hamburg, where 15 years earlier they were fighting in a war, actually less than 15 years earlier. So yeah, that's the age range. They come to America. They were somewhat successful in the UK, but at one point, April 1964, they had the top 5 songs. I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, Please Please Me, Twist and Shout, and one more song I can't remember. But imagine having the top 5 songs.
I don't have to imagine it.
That had never been done before in music history.
No, I remember. We should say George Harrison dies tragically from cancer. Was it 2001?
2001.
George Harrison passed away, but Sir Paul and Ringo are still still going strong.
Yeah.
I'm glad you and Rosalie got to see him recently. It was at Fenway Park in Boston, wasn't it?
Fenway Park. They gave
That's an evil place, but I'm sure Sir Paul was able to lighten the mood there a little bit.
Yankees. Incredible show. He's still got it. And but you know, heart and soul of the Beatles, one of the key members, of course, John and Paul were the songwriting duo.
Premier songwriting duo. Yeah.
Yeah, they have to be, I would think, the greatest songwriting team in the history of rock music.
Yeah. And they put one of the things if we talk about the talent, they pushed each other. The two of them, Lennon and McCartney, pushed each other to write more complex songs, because these in the early 60s, especially 1964, 65, they were simple songs, but bringing in two key figures, George Martin, who was the musical arranger, and Brian Epstein, the manager. Those were the two additional pieces of the puzzle that really made them this unit that, again, had not been seen before. And they started what we call the British invasion, because before the Beatles, no British band was popular in America. It was American, it was Motown, it was even the Beach Boys, solo artists like Bob Dylan. And
Bob Dylan was becoming huge around that same time. But let's not forget the Four Seasons, as immortalized in Jersey Boys and the great Clint Eastwood.
But another point, though, thank you, Andy. But another point is the Beatles wrote their own songs, and that was something that changed. Before them, Elvis didn't write his own songs. Frank Sinatra, and once the Beatles started doing that and saw the profit in it, again, the British invasion came and all these other.
Right. Well, let's not forget Bob Gaudio wrote some great songs for the Four Seasons.
Yes.
And the Four Seasons were the one American band that kept having #1 hits even during, the British invasion era. But the evolution of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting team was just extraordinary, because they started out writing these great love songs, typical, pop music songs. I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, great songs like that. But they evolved into, what they wrote a few years later, for Rubber Soul and Revolver, and especially for Sgt. Pepper, the Lonely Hearts Club Band. I mean, they really changed music from singles to albums as the primary way of conveying music and for artists to sell music and make money, and much more complex songs. And, I think Rolling Stone, if we're going to use Rolling Stone as any kind of authority on anything, I think I agree with you, John. That's a real leftist rag. I don't read it, but what I think when they listed the greatest rock albums of history not that long ago in the 21st century, I think Sgt. Pepper's they regarded Sgt. Pepper's as the most important rock album ever recorded, and it just changed. It changed the direction of rock music.
And a big part of that was the way that they used the recording studio. Prior to the Beatles, the recording engineers were people in white lab coats that went in and they read manuals and they positioned the microphone just so, and they had to do it by very particular rules. They couldn't break those rules and they were loath to do so. But the Beatles pushed everyone around them to level up and to get better and better and better at what they do, and to completely just go in a different direction, take recording in a different direction. Yeah. And so people like, you mentioned George Martin, but there's also Jeff Emmerich, one of the engineers that worked with the Beatles. And all sorts of funny stories, like some of the sort of older EMI people on sessions trying to mic a sitar, and they're like, they don't want to do anything but by the book, and didn't take Jeff Emmerich long to figure out that just doesn't work for what they were demanding. And so they had to create all sorts of new recording techniques, which I'm sure we'll get into later, but this really developed when they decided, you know what, we're not even going to worry about trying to play this stuff live anymore. We're done touring.
They stopped touring. So their first stadium act, you saw McCartney in the stadium. Beatles were the first band ever to play in a stadium, Shea Stadium. in
55,600
1965.
people.
And then after August of 1966, they said no more concerts. They couldn't hear themselves. They played for half an hour, and so they stopped. They stopped touring. They started making music videos, another innovation, and then they put all their energy into specifically the album version and record all these feedback and loops. But with Sgt. Pepper's, as you said, Andy, their goal was to make the greatest album ever, the greatest rock album. First album that had lyrics on it. That had never been done before. I'm grateful as a Rush fan who puts their lyrics in their albums.
In the liners,
yeah,
right?
that puts their lyrics in the album, and that's how I found out. Man, so Sgt.
And you
Pepper's
couldn't Google it. You couldn't Google it back then to find the lyrics. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And then right around that time, this was the Summer of Love, 1967. I think April 67 was Sgt. Pepper. And then satellite TV wanted to have, all these TV stations wanted to set up a global communication where they just all are in sync, and 300 million people watched All You Need Is Love. The Beatles, Mick Jagger, and a few others were there. So another never done before. So many ways the Beatles did things that just were not done before.
Yeah, and Beatlemania superseded, I think, any music mania that preceded it. I know, my parents' generation, when Frank Sinatra was young, in the 1930s, he would give a live concert. You have thousands of screaming teenage girls, who idolized Sinatra. And then 20 odd years later, mid to late 50s, Elvis, had that same kind of phenomenon. Just had thousands of women or teenage girls screaming. And by the way, I just want to say that the current Elvis movie that's out, I thought was very good. I think is worth seeing. Elvis was an extraordinary performer. He was absolutely an extraordinary performer, and the movie captures that. And his demise is so sad. The way he self-destructed.
John Lennon is quoted as saying, "No Elvis, no Beatles." That simple. All four of them were totally influenced by Elvis.
Elvis was great. He was
and Buddy Holly too. Buddy Holly, because their name it was Buddy Holly and the Crickets, and the Beatles took a different insect, Beatles, and they just changed it to beat, the drum beat. So that's actually how they got their name, in honor of Buddy Holly and the Crickets. Right.
No, absolutely. I just want to say Elvis had an extraordinary voice that you don't hear very often in rock. Yes. You listen to him sing "Love Me Tender" a cappella, and it's extraordinary. But he sadly self-destructed when he was still young. But anyway, yeah, Elvis was a phenomenon. The girls all went crazy for him. But Beatlemania, I think, superseded even Elvis's popularity. I mean, they'd be mobbed everywhere they went. They arrived at the airport. Was it when they arrived at Kennedy Airport in 64?
64, yeah.
Yeah, it was pouring rain, and there was still like thousands of people, mostly young women there to greet them. So yeah, it was just, and the screaming, like you said, one of the main reasons they gave up touring was because the screaming in the stadium was so loud they couldn't even hear their own music.
It was in response to that they actually created what we think of as the modern concert setup. You go to a concert these days, it's a given that the performers will have either in-ear monitors so that they can hear themselves, or they'll have old style wedges on the stage with speakers, and that's called the monitor system. And the Beatles were the first to use that in their concerts starting in Atlanta in 1964. Mm-hmm. So they had to invent these things and sort of take for granted
on the fly. Yeah, just in order to be heard or hear themselves. So many different ways. So if we go on, so now we have Sgt. Pepper's. Lennon is he meets Yoko not that long after. Oh no, actually first Brian Epstein. Once they stopped touring, Brian Epstein as the manager, his role was really reduced, fell into depression, died. And they were lost. They were leaderless, even though Lennon was.
But Brian Epstein died of a drug overdose, didn't he?
That's right. He died. Some say possibly suicide. He couldn't cope. He has a very tragic story, but he launched them. He got as a business. he really set them up to succeed. But when they stopped touring, a big part of his role was reduced. And then when he died, they were in Marrakesh, I think, somewhere. Harrison was getting into the whole Maharishi thing. So there were all these different things going on, but the leadership now fell on them. And this is when McCartney started doing more of the songwriting, and Lennon went less. Similarly, he struggled with depression, and the two of them as a great duo started going different ways. So by the time the White Album comes out in 1968, it's almost like all these outtakes, and they're not really playing as a band too much. But that album was known. It's a double album. It just says the Beatles in it. You have to look real closely to see that. And Helter Skelter, just some really, really fabulous songs. Birthday. We talk about. So my brother Pete saw McCartney in Jersey, the Giant Stadium, and it was right around his birthday. And he actually got Bruce Springsteen and Bon Jovi, two Jerseyites, to sing "Birthday," the song "Birthday" for him. And he's like, "Wow, I've played the song all these years, and I've never had someone play it to me." So that's on the White Album.
Here's a somber note, guys. You mentioned Helter Skelter. Charles Manson and his lunatic crowd claimed, that song, I don't know, you can't use the word inspired, but that song helped drive them to their hideous crimes. They claimed the Beatles were singing about, this kind of racism and revolution and all, and there's nothing. Those guys, Charles Manson and those guys were homicidally insane, but.
There are definitely some mixed aspects of the Beatles that I think we should get into. But you mentioned Brian Epstein and also George Martin. Both of them are commonly called the fifth Beatle, and I think
so was Murray DeCaze, the disc jockey who always played them. But
And Epstein, as you said, he was the one who discovered them, but he's also the one that molded them into the pop act that they became.
Image. Yes,
he told them no swearing, smoking, or eating on stage.
Yep, we're dressed the same. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, their look. You mentioned the British invasion. Of course, the Dave Clark Five came after the Beatles. They were very good for a while, but they flamed out. But the Rolling Stones, of course, became a gigantic success, and they're still together. But the Stones' image was so different from the Beatles. At least at first, before the Beatles became drug addicts, the Beatles had that clean cut. They wore the Beatles suits and the Beatle boots, and their hair was long but well groomed, and they were at least for those first few years, they were the good boys of the British invasion. The Stones were the bad boys.
Yes, Bob Dylan. If we talk about the drugs, when they first met, he gave him a joint. John Lennon took it right away, and he thought him, want to hold your hand when you say I can't hide. He thought they were saying I get high. So Dylan totally assumed that they smoked pot and everything, and they had never done that. And that was
the marijuana is relatively innocuous, but when they got into acid, and they
LSD, Lucy in the Skies with Diamond,
and that was not a conscious decision. We should mention either. They were actually what do you call it? Somebody slipped it into their drinks. It was
in a sugar cube.
But after that. To quote Timothy Leary, they turned on. They didn't drop out, but they turned on to acid for a while anyway. Unfortunately, they're lucky. They're lucky they didn't. There were people who were on acid back then who thought they could fly, and they jumped off the roof of a building and found out they couldn't. And plummeted to their death. Thank God. None of the Beatles did that. But it's like in Stir Gurg. If you're going to be if you're going to be a big rock band, you got to be drug users. It seems there are a few exceptions to that, but
I think Paul McCartney really disproves that, because although he did get into drugs for a time, look at him still going strong. And I think he's proof that music keeps you young. It's the unprotected sex and drugs that will kill you early.
Yeah,
and the booze, and the booze. But then you're right. That's a drug also.
To McCartney's credit, when he met Linda Eastman, daughter of George Eastman of Kodak, he stayed with her every single night of his life, except one night in Japan where he had a boatload of marijuana. And they threw him in jail for a night. That was the only night he did not spend with Linda until she died. So he was very faithful. And even within the Beatles, we can talk. So my favorite, in growing up, I have three brothers, and all I ever heard was Beatles, Beatles, Beatles. And I like them, but I preferred the Rolling Stones. But then even within the Beatles, I heard Lennon, Lennon, Lennon. And I was like, well, I like McCartney because his sense of life is just more joyous. And so, and then even when they went to solo careers, McCartney was the one that was my.
And Paul McCartney wrote and crooned some of the most beautiful love songs, you know, Michelle and Yesterday. He also had a beautiful voice. I think Yesterday is the single most covered song in rock history. And then, you know,
Scrambled Eggs was the original title. When he was writing it, he had the tune and he just had scrambled eggs. And then he thought about his mother. It's actually about his mother, the song. She's gone. And so that's, and initially he wanted that released as McCartney because he's the only one. They added some strings on it, but the other powers that be said no. It's the Beatles.
Yeah, he's beautiful crooner. You know, I mean, Michelle, Yesterday, and then on Let It Be. You know, their last album, Let It Be, is a beautiful song. Long and Winding Road is a beautiful song. And I know they had some creative differences with John Lennon, who liked a different sound than McCartney did. And by the way,
cynical. Yeah, and Lennon was more cynical in his lyrics. Yeah. And so they played off each other, but they also pushed each other. And here's where I credit George Harrison, because the two of them would bounce ideas off each other, but Harrison wrote all these great songs. They gave him 2 songs per album. Taxman is one of my favorite.
3 on Revolver.
Got 3 on Revolver. Taxman is the first song on the album. Martin. And then when the Beatles split up and he puts out a triple album, All Things Must Pass, and most of the songs were rejected by the Beatles.
And they're incredible.
Yeah,
they're
My Sweet Lord.
Let me ask you something, because I know you know the history better. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, was that a George Harrison song? It's beautiful.
With Eric Clapton playing guitar. Actually, Eric Clapton plays the lead.
That's not a bad guy to have playing guitar, you know, for you.
Clapton. Before the Patty Boyd went from Harrison to Clapton, and two of the most famous songs. Something is written about Patty Boyd, and Layla by Clapton is also written about Patty.
Well, she had good taste in guitarists, you know, certainly, and you know.
Sadly, Clapton was doing heroin when she was, and that was one reason she left. She left Harrison because he was not doing.
I know. Part of the creative. See, here's the thing. You guys mentioned Bob Dylan before, or Robert Zimmerman, right? That's his real name. Another icon from the 1960s who's still going strong. Here's a plug for individualism. You know, if you're a solo act, all you have to do is satisfy yourself, you know, creatively. If you have a band of 4 people, there's almost inevitably going to be creative differences that you have to negotiate, and very often they're non-negotiable. And those bands, how often do we see great rock bands split up over this? So I'm not saying there shouldn't be bands that everybody should just do a solo act, but there is an advantage. There is an advantage to, you know, being Bob Dylan, writing your own songs and having to please nobody but yourself.
Yeah, and I think that often in bands, what you have is a more dominant personality, and I think Lennon gladly ceded the leadership role to McCartney as time went on, and they started to write more and more apart. The complexity stemmed, I think, in part from that they weren't bouncing ideas off of each other, and some of the things got a little wacky, whereas if you had 2 people, one sort of giving feedback and helping the other edit their idea as it's coming out, now you've just got one guy, perhaps on drugs, coming up with parts that might not integrate so smoothly. Mm-hmm. But McCartney, you know, he changed music, incredible songwriter. One thing that I really wish, if we could run history again and do another experiment to see, is, you know, what the Beatles would have done had he given a little bit more respect to Harrison. Because in my opinion, George Harrison is, in terms of solo material, I think he's my favorite. these things are judgment calls, and a lot of it comes down to your sense of life, which we should talk about.
Yeah.
Ayn Rand had this concept of sense of life, which is your emotional, subconsciously integrated appraisal of man and existence, is the way that she put it. So we all know people that are kind of sour and nothing can ever seem to go right, and other people that are like bomb-proof and nothing, ever, they might have some bad moods from time to time, but they always sort of come back to that stable center. And I think that Paul and George most embody that really positive sense of life that we think of the Beatles as. And then you get this interesting injection of a different viewpoint from Lennon, who you said is more cynical.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
Yeah. And
Lennon preferred more of a hard rock sound. I think that McCartney was a beautiful crooner of love songs, and Lennon had a great voice for those hard rock songs. He was terrific. I could hear him singing, Dizzy Miss Lizzie, a lot of songs. Lennon. I mean, that's the Beatles were just amazing. They had all this tremendous songwriting talent. They had two outstanding lead singers. They were just extraordinarily gifted. But Lennon and McCartney. Paul McCartney to me has one of the all-time great voices in rock. John Lennon, very good, on a hard for a harder, hard rock sound.
So if we go to my favorite song, Andy, by them, "A Day in the Life," it's like two songs. It's the Lennon side, and then "The Dream" is the McCartney side. And then the way that song ends, again, nothing had been done like that. It just this builds up to this orchestral crescendo, and then I think they had 4 different musicians just playing that last note, which goes for 1 minute long. It's just this boom, and so it's the two of them at this creative height, working together with both of using both of their strengths, and they do that later on in their last album. What is it? From Let It Be. I've Got a Feeling. McCartney starts with "I've Got a Feeling," and then Lennon comes in. Everybody has a good time, and they're both. Then when they both sing together over each other, it's like, oh, these guys are just too much. They're just
they did that at the concert that I just saw.
Because,
John Lennon returned for the concert.
He came back.
Came back.
Sean Lennon or Julian Lennon, actually.
John Alan Jackson, the director of
Peter Jackson, the 6-hour Get Back.
Right.
He isolated Lennon's vocal track. And
okay.
That's what they did.
To do it live.
So it was actually Lennon.
So touching.
That's outstanding. We should put in the plug. I haven't seen Peter Jackson's, movie version of the Beatles.
It's 6.5 hours. I would shrink it down to about 4 hours.
So I'll say this: I saw his movie versions of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and it was outstanding. So I know Peter Jackson, is a talented director. I know that. By the way, a little grim humor here. Sometimes after John's assassination, maybe, and obviously before George's death from cancer in the 1980s or 1990s, there was some talk that the Beatles would get back together with Julian Lennon sitting in for his dad. I remember George Harrison said no, he nixed it. He said the Beatles are going to remain split up as long as John Lennon remains dead.
Yes.
And I thought that was
actually, talking about possible get-togethers in the mid-70s when Saturday Night Live had just started. Lorne Michaels, the director of the program, he offered the Beatles, everyone was offering them like millions of dollars. He was like, let's put it this way. If you guys come on, all 4 of you, we're going to offer you $3,000. Okay, $3,000. And Lennon and McCartney are at the Dakota. They're actually together, and they see this, and they're considering going down to Rockefeller Center where this was being recorded. And it didn't happen, but a few weeks later, George Harrison did play, and they gave him $750. That's how much they paid him for 1/4 of the $3,000 that they offered. So there were these possible times when they would get together after they broke up, but no, it never happened. And but just finishing off, like the Get Back series, you really see there was a movie called Let It Be that came out in the early 70s. Right. And you see the fighting, the bickering, especially Harrison and McCartney. Because McCartney's, here's the thing, as much as I love him, he was he was the one that made sure the work got done. So product, if we go by in terms of like productivity, he wanted a great product, and you see this in the back. He's like, these songs aren't good enough. We have to make them better. And most of the times the others had their money and they weren't really that ambitious to put, at least to work together as a team. And that was one reason that I thought McCartney kind of stood out. You can see that in the Get Back film.
They're all
Yeah, he was hard driving kind of guy. From what I've read, he was often very dissatisfied with George's work, and he was carping at George a lot. So Harrison had a whole bunch of complaints.
Yeah.
The Lennon McCartney songwriting team often, froze him out. Some of those great songs that Harrison wrote, he didn't get in, they didn't get to be recorded by the Beatles. Paul is carping at him and criticizing him constantly. I said he left the recording studio for days at a time, didn't he? Because he was so fed up.
The band, and that's in the film. He quit the band, and then first thing Lennon says is, "That's okay. We'll just get Clapton." Because they had this record, they had this thing they were going to record. There was a deadline to record this concert. It's like, we'll just get Clapton. So that
not a bad substitute as a guitarist to get one of the greatest rock guitarists of history. But so they put a little pressure. So John put a little pressure on George to return. Yeah. If you don't want your place, you don't be supplanted by Eric Clapton.
Yeah. So John had just finished giving a talk at TOSCon, and I want to see how we could kind of bring some of this, the Beatles music, into this idea of mind and music and morality. You want to just chat a little bit about that in the context of the Beatles and how we perceive them?
Well, one of the big things that I talked about at TOSCon was Ayn Rand's idea of sense of life, and the music that we listen to. Audio Technica is audiophile company. They make high-end audio products. Estimate that we spend 12 to 13 years of our lives listening to music. And of course, not only from lyrics alone, but just even from the physiological effects of the music has this profound impact on us. And so when we surround ourselves with music that is optimistic, that is upbeat, that enables us to see the world in a more positive light, it has the effect of surrounding yourself with a group of good friends that want the best for you and that are telling you, yes, you can, and this is how, as opposed to, I grew up listening to a lot of metal. Like Metallica was the only thing I listened to from 3rd to 8th grade, basically. Mm-hmm. And it in Rand's words, it really slants your view of the world, slants your consciousness, so that, if I'm listening to this music on the way to school, I get there and it's much easier to see the downside of things and to not look on the bright side of things.
Well, if you go into the public schools, John, there's a lot of down stuff there.
They reinforce each other, that's for sure, right?
Yeah.
Sort of a downward spiral there. So I think that, Paul McCartney in general and George Harrison to a large extent too, have created this body of music that I am in my mid-30s, and these songs were written in most cases, decades before I was born. And still, I'm a tremendous fan. They completely changed music history. They changed the way that recordings are made. I mean, my background is in audio engineering, and this is really, I don't know everything about the Beatles, but the thing that I know the most about is just how much they changed the recording studio situation. Yeah. So going back to Revolver for a minute, for instance, nowadays, if you go into a recording studio and you're going into a mixing session where all the tracks have already been recorded, now they're balancing the levels and they're panning things in the stereo field to get them just right. Well, prior to the Beatles, artists didn't go to the mixing sessions. The first time that they would hear the final track would be later on the radio. They'd hear the song as it was recorded on the radio, and they'd be like, oh, and if they didn't like something, too bad, too late. But with Revolver, the Beatles realized that they had this tremendous clout, and they could get what they wanted in the recording studio. So they started to sort of impinge a little bit on George Martin's his role as producer, and start to make demands as to what they wanted and where. And this just completely changes how music is produced, because nowadays the producer is much more collaborative with the band. and helping them get the sound and that they envision. So it's this back and forth as opposed to just and it's kind of funny because, just as an image of what this was like before, George Martin would always sit on a higher chair or stool than the Beatles so that he could kind of look down at them, as his students. Exactly. And give his feedback and sort of mold them the way that he wanted. But the Beatles really changed that dynamic. Not to say that George Martin wasn't incredibly important, because they didn't know how to do orchestrations and arrange for orchestras. And yet we have songs like Eleanor Rigby, for instance, which isn't just in a whole different sphere of its own. I mean, it's a pop song that is nothing but like vocals and double string quartet. And that was a Paul McCartney composition, right? Wasn't it? Eleanor Rigby? He wrote it on acoustic guitar. He played it for George Martin on acoustic and sang it. And George Martin said, "That's great, but I'm hearing strings." And they had some back and forth. Paul McCartney wasn't a fan at first, but he said, if you do it, make it edgy. It's got to be edgy. Right. So
it's Eleanor Rigby's an extraordinary song. I mean, the content, it's great music. What is it about? I mean, it's not your typical love song, that.
No, that is a bit dark. But let me just say something.
But it's a great song. Eleanor Rigby's a great song.
Yeah, I'm going to say something about Ringo, who also had a wonderful sense of life, who came from the lowest depths. They were all middle to lower class, and Ringo was complete lower class.
Richard Starkey.
Never saw his father except like once when he was very young, and was a better drummer than Pete Best, who was their original drummer, and went a long way towards their development. But Ringo, if I think of songs, Octopus's Garden, when he said, "We could be so happy, you and me," and with a little help from my friends, he has this benevolence that he continued in life. He's like the fun one that also makes me think of the Beatles when we don't think of like the darkness that they have. But so that's something a little bit about.
Ringo, I think, gets talked about the least. He's surrounded by three superstars. Ringo's a terrific drummer. I don't think anybody was a rock aficionado.
As his son Zach Starkey also is. He usually plays with the Who whenever they're in concert. So the first time I saw McCartney, 1986, Madison Square Garden, it was his first time performing after John Lennon's death. And all night long, I'm waiting for him to acknowledge Lennon, which he didn't. And in fact, the fans in back of me start chanting, "Yoko sucks." and if you look at the Get Back film, you never see John Lennon by himself. He was completely with Yoko, and he was a different man. And this is where the division between Lennon and McCartney became wider. Even though she had met Linda Eastman and they were together, Linda never really interfered with the Beatles as a band. And one time, about five years ago, I'm in Central Park. I would see Yoko regularly. She always had a bodyguard. I didn't live that far from her. And I'm riding a bicycle in Central Park, and it's icy. The road is icy. And I see her in the distance with an entourage. And I slow down the bicycle, and she's like stepping on the ice, like real timidly, but I could see the fear in her eyes. And I'm thinking, man, if this was 30 years ago, I could just run over save the Beatles. Imagine that.
Wait, hold on a second. Because we have to discuss Yoko Ono. I'm certainly no fan of hers. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, in the 1960s, she was a member of the Communist Party in Japan, wasn't she? I think
she's got some bad. I'm
pretty sure. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure she was a member of the Communist Party. By the 1960s, any honest person should have known that communism was a totalitarian state. So, but anyway,
sorry, Andy. In Revolution, the song Revolution, Lennon does have that line about Chairman Mao, and if you go talking about Chairman Mao, you ain't gonna make it with anyone anyhow. So I thought that was a little bit against the totalitarian aspect of communism.
Yeah, and back in the USSR showed there were no fans, of the Soviets. But she was a communist, literally a member of the party. That's pretty in 1960s. That's pretty bad. But I think she gets too much heat for breaking up the Beatles. And it's John and Paul. It was John's responsibility. I know the Beatles had a rule: no girlfriends in the studio, which is understandable because they're working. It's like I'm gonna teach a philosophy class. Should I bring my girlfriend there so she could be part of the class? It's not. No, it doesn't make any sense. So, but it's John's responsibility to say, honey, I love you. We're gonna marry you, but the Beatles this is a professional act. You're not part of the band. It's John's responsibility to keep her out. And Paul and George and Ringo should have insisted on it. Look, we got nothing against Yoko. You love her. She loves you. You guys are happy together, but she's not part of the band. She doesn't have any input, into the music. So, I think, John and Paul, especially John, but John and Paul were the leaders of the band. It was their responsibility to say, Yoko, see you afterwards, but we're working here.
But that didn't happen. If you go to Lennon's life, so he's with Cynthia Lennon in 1958. They have a child a couple of years later named Julian, and who Hey Jude. So McCartney was actually closer many times to Julian Lennon, that he wrote Hey Jude for him. And I love the line, take a sad song and make it better. That's talk about sense of life. It's like, yeah, let's take a sad song, let's actually make it better. And what Hey Jude did as a song completely shifted AM radio to FM radio, because back in the 60s, FM radio was just talk radio, and AM was short 2-minute singles. And Hey Jude was 7 minutes and change, and they started playing like a 3-minute version on AM radio. And then FM radio said, no, we're going to play the whole thing. And then this was another shift towards album-oriented rock, which is what FM radio became all about.
Yeah, and to me, that was, I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
Well, just talk about innovations. I mean, they basically invented the concept album. Correct?
Concept album, Sgt. Pepper's, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, to me, that was
a band, a different band that was not themselves.
Which is interesting because they were so burnt out on being this sort of bubblegum pop band that everybody. And then, granted, this is after Rubber Soul and Revolver, but still, Paul McCartney was looking for ways to shake things up, and the way that he came up to do that was, well, let's just create these alternate personalities.
Exactly.
To me, that was the Beatles' greatest innovation, was to shift rock music from primarily singles to albums. And the concept album, Sgt. Pepper is like the ne plus ultra of that. But I do want to say the early Beatles, they were a little bit poppy, and the traditional kind of love songs. They were great. I mean, even today, listen to nothing could be more bubblegum sounding than the lyrics. I mean, I want to hold your hand. I want to hold your hand. I mean, that's why. I mean, that's like so innocent and so innocuous. But you know what? It's a great song. It is a great song. I still love that song. She loves you and love me, and love me do. There's some, even the early Beatles is great and warranted the Beatlemania. In fact, Elton John said he thought the greatest rock song in history was I Saw Her Standing There. She was just 17.
John Lennon performed it with him on Thanksgiving 1974, and they released that as a song. That came out as a single. I'll never forget, because my brother went to that, and in fact, that was when Lennon got back with Yoko, and then they had sex, and Sean came out 9 months later. That's that concert. It's
with Yoko. You mean?
Yeah, he spent a year with May Pang in Florida. She gave him like carte blanche, go and do your drugs and be with this woman in like 73 to 74. And then in 75, the end of 74, they got back together.
All right. And now Cynthia Lennon is
no, I'm talking about Sean.
But Julian Lennon is Cynthia's mom. Cynthia's Julian's mom, right?
Yeah.
And I've heard that that John wasn't the greatest dad.
He wasn't the greatest dad. And Yoko, so if we can go back to what I don't like about her, when John Lennon got shot, Cynthia Lennon was banned from attending any services in New York, and Julian was allowed to come, and he had 15 bodyguards all around him. But so that was one of the things that Yoko rubs me the wrong way, and this documentary kind of makes it even even more so in seeing the two of them together.
I think there's no doubt that the Beatles are heroes, the greatest rock band in history. As I said earlier, they're definitely mixed, and we've hit upon a
Yes.
few of the
Yeah.
ways in which they were mixed. Well, one big one is that they were artists, they were musicians, and it's not as if they had some sort of life-serving rational philosophy to live by that enabled them to be perfectly consistent.
No.
But their irreverence, their joviality, their love of life almost always came through.
Yeah.
But
You're right, and you're right, John. We haven't discussed the movies. Like A Hard Day's Night. It's so much fun. You like you said, you see the irreverence and the joviality there. Now I haven't seen A Hard Day's Night since it came out. Now I'm inspired. I got to go by and see if it's available on Amazon Prime and watch it streaming again, because it was such a fun movie. And again, the Beatles revolutionizing the music industry. They had, there was, well, I guess, Sinatra became a big movie star. He's actually very good. Sinatra's actually a very good actor. We did him on the Hero Show. Elvis made a lot of movies, but they're mostly forgettable, unfortunately. But
music was before the Beatles and after. Like we can say that definitively about them, more so I think than any other act. And I remember back in 1999, I went to Liverpool and I went to the Cavern where they would play. This place is like a cave. It's just really, really tiny. And whenever I go to London, about 3-4 years ago, was the last time I went, I was walk Abbey Road barefoot, and then I see other people doing that as well. And so there's just all these legacies that they have left.
Yeah, we should mention. And by the way, I would suggest, if you guys haven't seen, out there in Hero Land, if you haven't seen A Hard Day's Night, and Help also, I thought both those movies, were a lot of fun. I would recommend watching them. But you mentioned the walking Abbey Road barefoot, because Paul, of course, is wearing like a suit jacket and everything. He's barefoot. And I can remember the hysteria. It's like 1969, 1970. The hysteria that emerged from that Paul was dead. I don't know if you guys,
and it was all over. He was dead. Yeah.
Yeah, it was all over the radio. This was supposed to be Paul walking barefoot. Somehow, in some people's crazed mind, meant that the Beatles were telling us in this oblique kind of way that Paul McCartney is dead. And this hysteria caught on. For lasted for months. You hear, you listen to FM radio where, like you said, where they were playing the full songs from the Beatles. That Paul McCartney's dead. It's just, it showed not just that a lot of people can be crazy and irrational, but how important the Beatles were to millions and millions and millions of people. That the idea that Paul McCartney was dead was just, it was just, absolute, it was absolute widespread, horror and craziness over this.
Not only were they this incredible creative force, but they also had a pretty huge impact on the culture. When they came to the US, they had never seen a segregated concert before. They didn't even know what that was. Yeah. And so they went to the South, they played in Florida, and they had this show where they were scheduled to play in front of a segregated audience. They said, "Hell no."
They said,
"We're not going to do it."
Yeah.
And so they demanded, and finally the city officials relented, breaking their own law here. And then they built into their contracts henceforth, going forward, that they would only play to integrated audiences.
Yeah, they paid tribute to the Black musicians who inspired them, and the racism, fortunately, in the UK was not nearly what it was, particularly in the American South, and the Beatles were having no part of it. They were using their influence, certainly in this sense, for the better. And that's one way they change. You talk about changing the culture, changing the world. These were some of the better ways that they did that.
Yeah. Now the Beatles were very, very morally upright in that regard, and get two big thumbs up. But if you talk about racism, obviously the Jim Crow South was horrific. It wasn't that way towards blacks in the UK or on the continent of Europe, but towards the Irish, you talk to a lot of the Irish in Britain, and they'll tell you that there's a lot of racism you know, there. And of
Harvey
course,
addressed that. He had a song, "Give Ireland Back to the Irish." That was actually his only political song back in like 71.
yeah, I mean, racism is just an unfortunate, you know, it's pandemic on the continent, of course, for centuries directed against the Jews, and you know, to some extent, I think still is. But yeah, the Beatles were very, very morally upright in standing up for integration in the American South. So you know, I think they really got
closing thoughts here on anything. You got a favorite song, Andy?
Favorite Beatles song. That's like, you know, trying to pick out the greatest baseball player of history. I tend towards, I love beautiful melodies, and Paul McCartney's you know, melodies to me are beautiful. I love Yesterday. I love Let It Be. So I think those would be my two favorite Beatles songs.
For me, I said A Day in the Life, and it kind of depends on the era, but In My Life is a Lennon song. Favorite Harrison song, Within You Without You, with the sitar, just so moving. And of Ringo, With a Little Help from My Friend. So I have one from each of them. Yeah.
Yeah, hard to decide, but I'd say Here Comes the Sun, Harrison song,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and also Taxman.
Yes.
Also a Harrison song.
Yes.
So my two favorite
Yeah,
Beatles songs
yeah.
are
Great.
George Harrison songs. But we should mention, though, in wrapping up, that not only did they make this, you know, take this public stance on racism, but I love the fact that just the whole sentiment of Taxman. This was George Harrison waking up to the fact that they're making all this money and they're getting these checks, and huge cuts are going directly to the government.
There's one for you, 19 for me. I'm
Right.
the tax man.
And it's
How's that?
one of the only
20
songs
bucks.
in which they name actual
Yes.
public officials. There was the prime minister at the time
Yes.
and
Mhm.
leader of the opposing party,
Yeah.
Heath and Wilson. And you know, another way in which they took a stance, well, really Lennon more than anyone else, but his comments on religion, which
Bigger than Jesus.
the Beatles are now.
He said. So, that's right. I want to mention John Lennon said that we're more popular than Jesus, right? And
he said that Christianity would soon fade.
Yes.
That's right.
From
He
the
did
culture.
both of those. Yeah.
That's right.
So
he should go spend some time in Alabama, you know, and see if you know.
Well, they started burning the Beatles records, and they said, well, first you have to buy them before you're going to burn them. So do what you want.
Yeah, right. Right. Well, the Beatles, you know, after I mean, you're right, Sean. You know that John Lennon said Christianity was gonna fade away, and he thought that was a good thing. And I know there was a few European countries. I think in Spain, you know, Catholic country. I think they stopped playing Beatles music on the radio. And surprisingly, one of the northern Europe was it in Holland maybe? It was usually, you know, very, very liberal and very, very secular. One of those northern European countries also banned the Beatles music on the radio for a while after that.
It's an interesting thing when you say something so provocative that the Pope speaks out against your band.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And he followed it up with Imagine There's No Religion. You know, it's easy if you try. And so just coming back to New York, my last point here, where we're at Strawberry Fields, whenever people come to New York, I bring them exactly to the Dakota, and then across the street, there's the Imagine plaque, and it's 24/7. There are people there, and what this and the broader area is called Strawberry Fields. It's really beautifully done. And if I think of like a nice tangible legacy that they've left, and it's a place to go to. It's like a global place where people from all over the world come to. I think, yeah, that's a nice cherry on icing on the cake, where their legacy it's going to go on. I mean, with the music,
they're heroes because they revolutionized pop music forever. One thing I want to say last is, I remember when Abbey Road came out. Was that 1969 or 1970?
69, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. And it didn't get the critical acclaim that say Sgt. Pepper's did. You know, a lot of critics panned it or mixed on Abbey Road. I thought then, and I think now, Abbey Road's a magnificent album. I think it's great work by the Beatles. Would have made a great capper to their career. But I think they actually, if I remember correctly, they actually released Let It Be after Abbey Road, even though they had recorded it before
Mhm.
Abbey Road, right? And Let It Be has those beautiful Paul McCartney songs, Let It Be, and Long and Winding Road. Although, from what I understand, McCartney himself didn't like the way Long and Winding Road turned out. I think he criticized him. Okay, Sir Paul, I understand, but there's a difference of creative opinion here. I love Long and Winding Road, so I want to thank you very much. I think it's a beautiful song.
So they end, if I could just say one last thing, Andy, they do this live performance. They stop performing, they go to the roof of Abbey Road. This is
Right.
now 1969, and it's cold, and they're wearing all this, they're all bundled up, and they play some of the songs they have been rehearsing. And you could see the film that the police have to stop. People are looking up to the roof of the studio, and it changes, just everything is stopped in its tracks. And that was their last thing that they did together. They did a McCartney song, they did a Lennon song, and 4, 5, 6 songs that are all captured in this, beautifully captured, actually, in this Get Back. I would say if you want the 6 hours of the Get Back documentary, the last 30 minutes is the payoff if you go through the whole thing. And what I love is at the end that they all applaud, the people on the roof applaud. So I'm going to ask the people in this room to applaud the end of this.
Yeah, we should have. Yeah, we should have a, instead of the hero music, we
Not
We
that
should have a
we're
Beatles song.
Nobody is hearing about the Beatles for the first time from this
Yes,
episode of the Hero Show,
yeah.
I'm sure, but I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about some real
Yes.
heroes of rock music.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Thanks for coming on the show, John.
Yes.
We should, for our outro, we should have a Beatles song rather than
On cue.
Okay. So first, let me salute the Beatles. Say
Yes, let's salute the
thank you
heroes.
very much for this extraordinary body of beautiful music that has lightened my life in so many different ways. And I want to wish everybody, we're going to strive to lead a more heroic life. Have a heroic day, and we'll be back next week again to celebrate more heroes on the Hero Show.
On the Hero Show, outro music.
Outro. All right.
All right.
Thank you.